The notary's pen scratched across the paper one last time. It was September 3rd, 1857, and the main hall of Blackwood Manor in Savannah, Georgia, had never witnessed such heavy silence. 11 people waited in that room as Notary Silas Crawford prepared to read the document that would transform an ordinary inheritance case into one of the most talked-about scandals in the South. Helena Blackwood sat with the rigid posture of someone who had not yet fully processed her loss. Widowed only a week, she wore the most expensive black dress Savannah had ever seen. Around her sat her 3 adult children, the family pastor, 2 lawyers, and carefully selected witnesses from the local elite. Everyone expected the obvious, the formal division of a fortune built on cotton, merchant ships, and land stretching across 3 counties. None of them imagined that in less than 10 minutes they would discover they knew far less about Jonathan Blackwood than they thought, because the man they had buried with military honors, the respected Mexican war veteran, the philanthropist who had donated funds to 3 churches, had kept a secret for 12 years. A secret that would now explode in the center of Savannah society like an artillery bomb. But before revealing what was written in that will and why Jonathan Blackwood's final decision would destroy not only his family but force all of Georgia to confront questions no one wanted to ask. Leave a comment and tell us what you think drives a man to destroy his own legacy. Can you forgive a man who tries to correct a lifetime of mistakes with a single final act? Or are some sins too great for redemption? Silas Crawford adjusted his glasses. His voice sounded hesitant from the first word. Mrs. Blackwood, gentlemen, this will was drafted in my presence 3 months ago, when Mr. Blackwood already had knowledge of the severity of his heart condition. I must warn you that its contents are extraordinarily unusual. The eldest son, Jonathan Jr., a 32-year-old man accustomed to command, interrupted him. Silas, we've known you since you were a child. Just read the document. Crawford took a deep breath. To my son, Jonathan Blackwood, Jr., I leave my gold pocket watch and the sum of $50. Jonathan Jr. blinked, confused. There must be a typographical error. To my daughter, Margaret Blackwood, I leave your grandmother's pearl necklace and the sum of $50. Margaret turned pale. To my son, Thomas Blackwood, I leave my collection of law books and the sum of $50. Thomas stood up. Father owned 2 merchant ships, 4,000 acres, a house, and please sit down. Crawford's voice was breaking. To my wife, Helena Marie Blackwood, I leave the furniture from our bedroom and the sum of $200. Helena made no sound. She simply stopped breathing. The remainder of my property, including the entirety of Blackwood Plantation, the Blackwood & Sons merchant fleet, the port warehouses, the urban properties, all investments, bonds, and bank funds. I leave in its entirety to a boy known as Isaac, approximately 12 years of age, blind since birth, currently residing in the slave quarters of this property. The wall clock marked the seconds as the words slowly penetrated the minds of those present. Then Helena screamed. It was not a scream of sadness or surprise. It was an animal scream primitive of something being torn from her entrails. She grabbed the arm of the family lawyer, Dr. Whitmore, with enough force to leave marks. This is false. My husband would never. There is more, madam, Crawford continued. And now there were tears in his eyes. I solemnly declare that the boy Isaac is my biological son, born of my union with an enslaved woman named Ruth. I acknowledge that I kept this child in conditions of captivity throughout his entire life, despite being fruit of my own blood. I acknowledge that I allowed my son to grow up without a family name, without recognition, without the privileges that his half-siblings received by birthright. This is an injustice I can no longer tolerate. Jonathan Jr.'s face was now intensely red. My father would not write this. He would not use these words. He would not. These are the exact words he dictated, Crawford said firmly. I can present 3 witnesses who were present at the drafting. Margaret began to cry silently. Thomas seemed petrified, but it was Helena who found her voice first, and when she spoke, each word was a sharp blade. Where is she? Madame, the woman, Ruth. Where is the prostitute who seduced my husband and spawned this? This. The boy's mother died in childbirth of a second child 6 years ago in 1851, Crawford said softly. The child did not survive either. For a moment, something passed across Helena's face. Was it guilt? Relief? But it disappeared as quickly as it appeared. And the boy. Where is he? As if summoned by the words, the door opened. What entered was not what Helena expected. Isaac was small for his 12 years, too thin with the body of someone who had never had enough food. He wore patched clothes, clean but worn. His bare feet made small sounds on the polished wooden floor, but it was not his physical appearance that captured everyone's gaze in the room. It was the way he moved. He entered with one hand extended, lightly touching the wall. His head turned subtly as if listening to echoes others could not hear, and his eyes completely white without pupils focused on nothing but somehow seemed to see everything. "They brought me here, sir," Isaac said toward Crawford, his voice surprisingly clear. "They said it was about Master Blackwood." He did not know he should call Jonathan father. No one had ever told him. Helena looked at the boy and saw, really sore for the first time, the bone structure that was undeniably Blackwood, the shape of the chin, the high forehead, the mouth that was identical to Jonathan Jr.'s. "You," she whispered, "you come to the big house every afternoon for years. I thought you just cleaned the stables." "Yes, ma'am," Isaac replied. "I clean the stables every morning, but in the afternoon the master took me to the music room." "To do what?" Isaac hesitated, as if he knew his answer would be dangerous. "To play piano, ma'am. He said it was the only useful thing a boy like me could do." The silence that followed was absolute because everyone in that room, everyone in Savannah society, knew about the piano at Blackwood Manor. It was an imported Steinway. The only one within 300 miles. And in the afternoons, music flowed from that room, music so beautiful that visitors stopped at the doors to listen. Everyone assumed it was Jonathan playing a hidden talent of the plantation master. No one had ever imagined the music came from a blind slave boy. "You," Margaret whispered, recognition illuminating her face with horror. "You played at Mother's birthday. We were all there and Papa said he had hired a musician from Charleston, but you were behind the screen and we—" She covered her mouth with her hands. Helena turned to Crawford with wild eyes. "This will cannot be valid." "A slave boy cannot inherit property. The law, the will, also frees him, madam," Crawford interrupted, "and it establishes a complex trust with appointed guardians to administer the property until Isaac reaches majority." "Guardians? Who would be foolish enough to?" "I would," said a voice from the door. Everyone turned. In the entrance stood Josiah Freeman, a free black man who owned a small carpentry shop in the Port District. Few in the room knew him, but Jonathan Blackwood knew him. Josiah had been freed 20 years earlier and built a respectable business through hard work and undeniable skill. "Jonathan approached me 6 months ago," Josiah continued, entering the room with careful dignity. "He asked me to serve as Isaac's guardian. I accepted." "You?" Jonathan Jr. laughed with disbelief. "A carpenter is going to manage a shipping company." "Not alone," Josiah said calmly. "The will names a commission of 3 guardians. I am responsible for Isaac's personal interests. Mr. Crawford here oversees the legal aspects, and the 3rd guardian." He paused, and something in his expression suggested this would be the most shocking revelation is Reverend Samuel Ashton. Everyone in the room knew Reverend Ashton. He was Savannah's most respected Presbyterian pastor, a man whose word carried weight even in the highest circles of society. Samuel Ashton agreed to this. Helena could barely form the words. "He not only agreed," Crawford said softly, "he helped Jonathan structure the entire will. He spent months ensuring every aspect was legally sound." Helena staggered. Margaret had to hold her up because if Reverend Ashton was involved, this was not just a family scandal. It was a moral statement, a public condemnation of everything Savannah society considered acceptable. "This is not going to happen," Jonathan Jr. said, his voice low and dangerous. "We will not allow the Blackwood name to be destroyed by a— Be careful with your next words, sir." Josiah's voice was calm but had a steel edge. "Isaac is legally free. Publicly defaming him would have legal consequences." "Consequences?" Jonathan Jr. laughed bitterly. "You are threatening the Blackwood family. I am informing you that the will was drafted by lawyers better than any you can hire. Jonathan spent his last year of life ensuring this would be indestructible. And that is how the war began. The hours following the will reading would later be described by household servants as the closest thing to warfare they had witnessed without actual gunfire. Helena Blackwood did not leave. Legally, she could not be forced to. The will granted Isaac ownership, but Helena still had rights as the widow, even if Jonathan had tried to minimize them. So she stayed, and she made sure everyone knew she was staying. That first night, Helena gathered her children in the master bedroom, the bedroom she had shared with Jonathan for 28 years, and made them swear an oath. Thomas would later testify in court about what his mother said that night. "We will fight this abomination with every legal weapon we possess." We will expose that boy for what he is, a mistake, a living embodiment of your father's sin. We will prove your father was manipulated, his mind poisoned by illness, and we will take back what is rightfully ours, even if it takes the rest of our lives. But while Helena rallied her children upstairs, something else was happening in the small room behind the kitchen where Isaac had lived for 12 years. Isaac sat on the edge of his narrow bed. He had no siblings to comfort him, no mother to explain what was happening. Ruth had died 6 years earlier, and since then he had lived alone in a world he could not see, surrounded by people who resented his existence. A soft knock came at his door. Before he could respond, it opened, and he heard familiar footsteps. Isaac. Josiah Freeman's deep voice filled the small space. We need to talk about what happens now. Isaac turned his white eyes toward the voice. Are they going to kill me, Mr. Freeman? The question was so direct, so devoid of emotion, that Josiah felt his heart break. This child had lived his entire life knowing he was hated, knowing his existence was a threat to everyone around him. No one is going to kill you, Josiah said firmly, though he was not entirely certain this was true. But they are going to fight in court, in society, in every way they can, and you need to understand what you are now. You are free, Isaac, legally, completely free. And you are one of the wealthiest property owners in Georgia. I don't understand what that means, Isaac said quietly. I've never been allowed to leave this property. I don't know what money is. Not really. Master Blackwood tried to explain it to me once, but it's hard to understand something you can't touch or see. Josiah sat down beside the boy. Then I will teach you. That is my job now, to teach you how to be free, how to manage property, how to survive in a world that does not want you to exist. Why? Isaac asked. Why did he do this? Master Blackwood never called me his son. He never acknowledged me in front of anyone. Why give me everything now that he is dead? It was the question everyone would ask in the coming years. And Josiah, who had spent long hours talking with Jonathan Blackwood in the months before his death, knew at least part of the answer. Because your father was a coward when he was alive, Josiah said bluntly, and he hoped that being brave when he died would somehow make up for it. I do not know if it does, but it is what we have to work with. What had happened between Jonathan Blackwood and Ruth was a story whispered about in the slave quarters, but never spoken aloud in daylight. And now, with the will made public, those whispers were about to become testimony in open court. Jonathan Blackwood had purchased Ruth in 1844 at an estate sale outside Savannah. The seller was a widow liquidating assets, and Ruth was listed as house-reigned, skilled in weaving and spinning, excellent temperament. She was 19 years old. Jonathan paid $800 for her, a standard price. His wife, Helena, had been pregnant with their youngest child, Thomas, and needed additional help with household tasks. So Ruth came to Blackwood Manor, and for several months she was simply another enslaved woman working in the house. Then, in the summer of 1844, something changed. An elderly woman named Aunt Clara, who had worked at Blackwood Manor for 40 years, would later testify about what she witnessed. Master Blackwood started visiting the weaving house more often than he needed to. At first, I thought maybe he was just checking on the work, but then I noticed Ruth getting quieter, more withdrawn. She stopped singing while she worked, and I knew every woman who has lived on a plantation knows that look, knows what it means when a master starts paying too much attention. Ruth became pregnant in the fall of 1844. When the midwife examined her and announced the news, Helena Blackwood's response was to have Ruth moved from the main house to a small cabin near the slave quarters. Out of sight, out of mind, the way such situations were typically handled. The baby was born in May 1845. The midwife, a free black woman named Sarah who attended births throughout the county, kept detailed records. She noted that the child was a boy born with a caul over his face, considered a sign of second sight in many traditions, but within hours it was clear something was wrong. The baby's eyes did not focus. They were clouded, milky white. The child was blind. Sarah would testify that when she informed Jonathan Blackwood of his son's condition, his response was chilling. A blind slave is worthless. Let nature take its course. He meant leave the baby to die, but Ruth refused. She nursed Isaac, cared for him, kept him alive through sheer determination. And Jonathan, perhaps out of some buried shame, did not insist. He simply ignored the child's existence. For the first 6 years of Isaac's life, Jonathan Blackwood never acknowledged him. The boy was raised in the slave quarters, learning to navigate his dark world by sound and touch. Other enslaved children were cruel to him, as children often are to those who are different. Isaac learned early to stay quiet, to take up as little space as possible, to be invisible in every way except the one that mattered most. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was September 1851. Jonathan was walking past the slave quarters at dusk when he heard singing. Not words, just melody. Pure, perfect, heartbreaking melody. He followed the sound and found a small boy, maybe 6 years old, sitting alone outside a cabin singing to himself. The child's eyes were white and unseeing, but his voice was like nothing Jonathan had ever heard. "Who are you?" Jonathan asked. The boy turned toward the sound of his voice. "I'm Isaac, sir, Ruth's boy." Jonathan felt something crack open inside his chest. This was his son, his child, sitting in the dirt, blind, alone, singing with a voice that could move angels, and Ruth had been dead for 3 months. The boy had lost his mother and had no one. "Do you know who I am?" Jonathan asked. "You are the master, sir." Not father, not papa, the master. Jonathan made a decision in that moment that would define the rest of his life and destroy his family after his death. "Come with me," he said. He took Isaac to the big house, to the music room where the Steinway piano sat unused. Helena played occasionally, but without particular skill or passion. The piano was more decoration than instrument. Jonathan sat Isaac on the bench and pressed one of his small hands to the keys. Isaac's face transformed. He pressed another key, then another. Within minutes, he was picking out a melody. Within an hour, he was playing a simple tune. Within a month, he could play Mozart from memory. Jonathan told Helena it was a charitable project. He was teaching a talented slave boy to play piano, demonstrating that even the most humble could be elevated through culture and refinement. Helena found it amusing, a quirk of her husband's that she could mention at social gatherings. "Look at the good work Jonathan does, teaching even a blind slave child to appreciate fine music." She never knew the child was her husband's son, or perhaps she did know and chose not to see, the way so many women in her position chose not to see. For 6 years, this routine continued. Every afternoon, Isaac would come to the big house. Jonathan would teach him piano, then reading through specially made embossed blocks, then mathematics and history and philosophy. He poured into this blind child all the education he had given his legitimate sons, and more. But Isaac always returned to the slave quarters at night, always slept on a thin mattress in a drafty cabin, always ate the minimal rations allocated to enslaved people, always lived in the knowledge that he was property, that everything he had could be taken away at any moment. In September 1851, when Jonathan first brought Isaac to the house for piano lessons, the boy had just lost his mother. Ruth had died in childbirth 3 months earlier in June 1851, along with the infant daughter she tried to bring into the world. Isaac was 6 years old. He had lost the only person who had ever truly loved him. Jonathan Blackwood attended the burial. He stood at the edge of the slave cemetery and watched as they lowered Ruth into the ground, and he felt for perhaps the first time in his life the full weight of what he had done. He had used a woman who could not refuse him. He had fathered children into slavery. He had given one of those children just enough knowledge to understand how thoroughly he had been betrayed by the man who should have protected him. That night, Jonathan began thinking about his will. Though he would not act on those thoughts for another 5 years, the fear of social destruction, of losing everything he had built, kept him silent for half a decade more. But the seed had been planted, growing slowly in his conscience until his failing heart forced him to finally act. The legal battle that followed the reading of Jonathan Blackwood's will would consume 8 years and expose the deepest hypocrisies of Savannah society. The Blackwood family hired 4 different law firms, the finest legal minds in Georgia. They filed their petition in the Georgia Superior Court within 2 weeks of the will reading, arguing on 3 primary grounds. First, they claimed Jonathan had been mentally incompetent when he dictated the will. Jonathan had suffered from heart disease in his final year, experiencing episodes of chest pain, shortness of breath, and fatigue. The family's lawyers brought in a physician, Dr. Marcus Hendris, who testified that such conditions often affected mental capacity. A man suffering from severe heart disease is not in his right mind. Dr. Hicks stated confidently, "The reduced blood flow to the brain causes confusion, impaired judgment, and susceptibility to manipulation." But when Silas Crawford cross-examined, He produced medical records from 3 other physicians who had treated Jonathan. All testified that while Jonathan was physically ill, his mind remained sharp until hours before his death. Dr. Benjamin Morris, who had been Jonathan's primary physician, gave particularly damaging testimony for the Blackwood family's case. Jonathan Blackwood was one of the most mentally acute patients I have ever treated. Even as his body failed, his mind remained clear. He discussed his business affairs with perfect lucidity, settled his accounts, gave instructions for his funeral. He knew exactly what he was doing when he made his will. The second argument was undue influence. The family's lawyers painted a picture of a dying manipulated by radical abolitionists, specifically Josiah Freeman and Reverend Ashton, who had taken advantage of his illness to push their political agenda. These men, thundered the lead attorney, Harrison Whitfield, saw an opportunity to strike a blow against the institution that has sustained Southern prosperity for generations. They found a sick, dying man and twisted his natural affection for a talented slave boy into something unnatural, something that violates every principle of law and morality. But this argument crumbled when Reverend Ashton took the stand. Samuel Ashton was 63 years old, a man who had served Savannah's Presbyterian community for 35 years. He was known as a moderate voice, not an abolitionist firebrand, but a thoughtful minister who urged Christian charity and temperance. His testimony would prove devastating to the Blackwood family's case. Jonathan Blackwood came to me in January of 1857. Reverend Ashton testified. He told me he was dying and needed spiritual counsel. We met every week for 6 months, and in those meetings he unburdened his soul. What did he tell you? Crawford asked. He told me about Ruth, about Isaac, about the life he had lived and the lies he had told himself to justify it. He wept. Mr. Crawford, this proud man, this pillar of Savannah society, wept like a child and asked me if God could forgive what he had done. What did you tell him? I told him that God's forgiveness was available to all who truly repented. But I also told him that repentance requires action, not just words. That if he truly wanted to make amends, he needed to do more than feel sorry. He needed to do what he could to repair the harm. Did you suggest he change his will? I did not suggest specifics. I simply told him that a man who has wronged someone owes them restitution. What form that restitution took was between him and his conscience. Harrison Whitfield tried to discredit Ashton on cross-examination. Reverend, are you not known for your abolitionist sympathies? I am known for my Christian convictions, sir. I believe all men are created in God's image and deserve to be treated as such. If that makes me an abolitionist in your eyes, then I accept the label. So, you used a dying man's guilt to push your political agenda. Ashton's eyes flashed. I used a dying man's conscience to help him see truth. Jonathan Blackwood was not manipulated by me or anyone else. He made his decision because he finally allowed himself to see what he had spent years refusing to see. That his son was a human being who deserved better than to be property. The courtroom buzzed with reaction. Judge Marcus Peaton, who was presiding over the case, had to call for order. But the family's third argument was the most powerful and the most difficult to counter. They argued that regardless of Jonathan's intentions or mental state, Georgia law simply did not permit what the will attempted to do. The law was clear. Free people of color in Georgia had severely restricted property rights. They could not vote, could not testify against white people in court, could not own certain types of businesses, and faced strict limits on property ownership. While the law did not explicitly forbid a freed slave from inheriting property, it had never contemplated anything on the scale of the Blackwood estate. Your Honor, Harrison Whitfield argued, if we allow this will to stand, we are saying that a Negro boy, freed only by the technicality of this document, can own one of the largest plantations in Georgia, can own ships, can own commercial properties, can control business interests that affect the livelihood of dozens of white families. This is not what the legislature intended when it allowed limited property rights for free people of color. It was a powerful argument because it was true. The law had been written assuming free black people would own small plots of land, perhaps a house, maybe a small business. No one had imagined someone like Isaac. Crawford's response was equally powerful. Your Honor, the law does not specify a maximum amount of property a free person of color can own. It restricts their rights after ownership, yes, but it does not cap the amount. My opponent wants you to invent a restriction that does not exist in statute simply because he finds the result uncomfortable. But courts do not make law based on comfort. They interpret the law as written. And as written, Jonathan Blackwood had every right to free Isaac and every right to leave him property. Judge Peaton took a month to issue his preliminary ruling. When he did, it satisfied no one. This court finds that the will of Jonathan Blackwood was executed properly and reflects his true intentions. However, the court also finds that implementing the will as written would create legal and social complications beyond what Georgia law contemplated. Therefore, this court orders the following. Isaac shall receive his freedom as stipulated. He shall receive ownership of 800 acres of Blackwood Plantation, the northern tract, along with one of the ships from the Blackwood fleet, the merchant vessel Liberty. He shall receive $20,000 in trust to be administered by his appointed guardians until he reaches majority at age 21. The remainder of the estate shall be divided among Jonathan Blackwood's widow and legitimate children according to standard inheritance law. Both sides immediately filed appeals. The case wound its way through the Georgia court system for years. New evidence was introduced, new witnesses testified, new legal arguments were made. The Blackwood family spent tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Isaac's trust spent nearly as much. And through it all, Isaac lived in a strange limbo, legally free but not fully free, wealthy on paper but unable to access most of his wealth, living on the property he supposedly owned, while the family that hated him occupied the main house. Josiah Freeman moved into a cabin on the northern tract to protect Isaac. There were threats, both explicit and implied. One night, someone fired shots through the window of the cabin. Another time, Isaac's guide dog, a gentle animal Jonathan had given him years before, was found poisoned. Helena and her children remained in the big house, refusing to acknowledge Isaac's legal status. They continued to operate the plantation as if nothing had changed, using the enslaved workers, selling the crops, conducting business. When Crawford protested, they argued that until all appeals were exhausted, the will had not been finally probated, so they remained the legal owners. It was psychological warfare. Every day, Isaac could hear the plantation operating around him, knew that people who hated him controlled everything he supposedly owned, lived with the knowledge that one successful appeal could strip away everything. Margaret Blackwood, alone among her siblings, struggled with the situation. She was 31 years old, unmarried, and living a life she had never questioned until her father's death forced her to question everything. 6 months after the will reading, she found Isaac in the old music room. He sat at the Steinway piano, his fingers moving across keys that had been carefully tuned by Josiah. He was playing Chopin, a nocturne so beautiful it made her heart ache. "How do you do that?" she asked. Isaac's hand stopped. He turned his white eyes toward her voice. "Miss Margaret, how do you play like that when you have never seen sheet music, never seen a piano, never seen anything?" Isaac was quiet for a moment. "I see with my hands, Miss Margaret. I see with my ears. The world is not silent, you know. Everything makes sound. Everything has texture. I just experience it differently than you do." Margaret sat down on a chair near the piano. "Did you know? Before the will was read, did you know what Father planned to do? He told me 3 days before he died. He came to my cabin and told me he had done something that would either save me or destroy me. He said he was sorry for everything and that he hoped I could forgive him someday. Then he died, and I learned what he meant. Do you forgive him?" Isaac's hands returned to the piano, playing soft, aimless notes. "I do not know if forgiveness is possible for some things, Miss Margaret. Your father gave me gifts no other enslaved person receives. He educated me, taught me beauty, showed me there was more to the world than suffering. But he also kept me in chains while he did it. He gave me knowledge that made my chains unbearable. So I do not know if I forgive him. I only know I am still here, still fighting to keep what he gave me because the alternative is going back to being nothing." Margaret left the room with tears streaming down her face, not knowing if she cried for Isaac, for herself, for her father, or for all of them caught in a situation with no good answers. The case finally reached the Georgia Supreme Court in 1862. By then, the nation was tearing itself apart over the very questions the Blackwood case embodied. Could black people own property? Were they fully human? Did the South have the right to maintain a system built on owning human beings? The Supreme Court heard arguments in January 1863. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and citizens from across Georgia. Everyone understood this was about more than one family's inheritance. This was about the fundamental structure of Southern society. The court's decision came in March 1863. Chief Justice Henry Benning, known for his pro-slavery views, nonetheless wrote an opinion that shocked both sides. This court finds that Jonathan Blackwood's will was legally executed and reflected his true intentions. While the magnitude of the bequest is unusual, the law does not specify maximum amounts for inheritance by free people of color. The will is valid and shall be probated as written with the modifications ordered by the lower court to remain in effect. But Benning added a paragraph that revealed his true feelings. This court notes with regret that the necessities of law sometimes require outcomes that violate natural order and social propriety. We do not endorse the testator's choices, only acknowledge they were legally his to make. How society addresses such situations remains a question for the legislature, not the judiciary. Isaac had won. After 8 years of legal battle from age 12 to age 20, the will was finally completely validated, but the victory was hollow. By March 1863, the Civil War had been raging for 2 years. Georgia's economy was collapsing. The Blackwood ships had been seized by the Confederate government for war use. The plantation was producing almost nothing as enslaved workers fled to Union lines whenever possible. The Confederate currency, in which much of the estate's value was held, was rapidly becoming worthless. When Isaac finally took full control of his inheritance at age 20 in May 1865, just weeks after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, he discovered it was worth perhaps 1/10 of the original value. The money was nearly gone, spent on legal fees and devalued by Confederate collapse. The ships were destroyed or missing, the plantation was damaged, its fields unplanted, its buildings in disrepair. But he still had 800 acres of land. He still had the big house on the northern tract, and unlike almost every other formerly enslaved person in Georgia, he had legal ownership validated by the highest court in the state. Helena and her children left Blackwood Manor in June 1865. They moved to a modest house in Savannah, living on what little remained of their portion of the estate. Helena never spoke to Isaac again. She died in 1871, bitter and broken, insisting until her last breath that her husband had been manipulated and her life stolen. Jonathan Jr. moved to Texas, trying to rebuild his fortune in a new place where the Blackwood name was unknown. Thomas became a small-town lawyer in South Carolina. The two sons never reconciled with their half-brother, never acknowledged his existence beyond what the law required. But Margaret did something different. In 1866, she returned to Blackwood Manor and knocked on the door of the Northern Tract's main house. When Isaac answered, she said simply, "I want to help." "Help with what, Miss Margaret?" "With whatever you are planning to do with this place, because if you try to do it alone in a place that hates you with resources you barely have, you will fail. And I think perhaps that is not what should happen." Isaac did not trust her. Not at first. How could he? She was the daughter of the woman who had tried to destroy him. But slowly, carefully, they built something new together. Isaac transformed Blackwood Manor's northern tract into something unprecedented in Georgia. A school for blind children. He brought in teachers from the north, people who had experience with specialized education. He created workshops where blind students could learn carpentry, weaving, music, skills that would allow them to support themselves. And he did something even more radical. He admitted both white and black students. In 1867, in the heart of Georgia during the chaos of Reconstruction, children of both races learned side by side at Blackwood School for the Blind. It was illegal, or at least against social custom. It was dangerous. There were threats, vandalism, violence. But Isaac persisted, and Margaret helped him, teaching classes, managing correspondence, using her name and social position to give the school legitimacy it would not have had otherwise. Josiah Freeman remained as well, now officially employed as the school's business manager. The three of them, a blind black man, a white spinster, and a free black carpenter, built something that should not have been possible. The school struggled constantly. Money was always tight. Political opposition was fierce. But it survived. By 1870, it had 24 students. By 187,537. By 1880, 53, with students coming from across the South. Isaac never married. His life was consumed by the school, by the mission of proving that people like him, blind, black, or both, deserved education and opportunity. He gave everything to that mission, the way his father had taken everything from his mother. Margaret never married either. She lived in a small house on the school grounds, teaching until she was too old to continue, then simply being present, a reminder that some white Southerners had chosen differently. Josiah married late in life to a teacher at the school and had 2 children who grew up running through the grounds of Blackwood Manor, free in ways their father had never imagined possible. In 1903, Isaac died at age 58. The cause was pneumonia, a common killer of the elderly in that era. Margaret sat with him through his final days, now an old woman herself, holding the hand of her half-brother as he slipped away. "Did we do enough?" Isaac asked in one of his last lucid moments. Did we make his guilt worth something? Margaret did not know how to answer. How do you measure whether a lifetime of work justified one man's attempt at redemption? How do you weigh 8 years of legal battle and 40 years of struggle against the simple fact that children who would have been ignored now had education, skills, futures? "We tried," she said finally. "That is all anyone can do. We tried to make something good from something terrible." Isaac died that night. In his will, he left the school property in trust to be maintained in perpetuity as an educational institution. He left generous donations to each of his teachers, and he left Margaret a sum of money that would sustain her comfortably for the rest of her life. When the lawyer read that provision to her, Margaret wept. "He did not owe me anything," she whispered. "After what our family did to him, he owed me nothing." Perhaps, the lawyer suggested gently, he was not paying a debt. Perhaps he was simply doing what your father should have done, recognizing family. Margaret lived another 6 years, dying peacefully in 1909. She was buried in the school cemetery next to Isaac in a plot that would have been illegal just 40 years earlier. A white woman and a black man resting side by side for eternity. So, what do we learn from the story of Jonathan Blackwood and Isaac? That deathbed confessions do not erase lifetime sins? That you cannot buy redemption with property and money? That some injustices are too fundamental to be corrected by legal documents? Yes, all of that. But perhaps we also learned something more nuanced and more difficult. We learned that even in systems designed to make goodness impossible, some people still try to choose differently. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but differently. Jonathan Blackwood was not a hero. He was a man who committed evil for years, who used his power to exploit someone powerless, who fathered children into slavery and then kept them in slavery because acknowledging them would have been inconvenient. But at the end, facing death and judgment, he chose honesty over comfort. He destroyed his family's wealth, his own legacy, his wife's security to give his blind son a chance at freedom and dignity. Was it enough? No, it could never be enough. Did it compensate for his sins? Absolutely not. But it gave Isaac something no one else had given him. The acknowledgement that he was human, that he deserved recognition that his life had value beyond his usefulness to others. And from that acknowledgement, from that deeply flawed and inadequate gesture, grew something unexpected. A school, an education, opportunity for children who would have had none. Proof that even in the darkest systems, some light could find its way through. The Blackwood School for the Blind still exists today, though it is now a museum and historical site. The main building has been carefully preserved, and visitors can walk through rooms where blind children once learned to read with their fingers, to work with their hands, to believe their lives had meaning. In the music room, the Steinway piano still stands, restored and maintained. It is played occasionally for special events, and when it is, the sound fills the old house with the same beauty Isaac once created in his darkness. And on the wall beside the piano, a simple brass plaque reads, "In memory of Isaac Blackwood, 1845 to 1903, who taught us that even in darkness, music finds its way." And in memory of Jonathan Blackwood, 1809 to 1857, who learned too late that some truths cannot be hidden forever. It is not forgiveness, that plaque. It is not absolution. It is simply acknowledgement, honest and clear, of what happened here, of the people who struggled and failed and tried again, of the complicated, painful, insufficient attempts at redemption that define this place. And perhaps in the end, that acknowledgement is all we can offer. Not easy answers or comfortable narratives, but the hard truth that our history is full of people who failed and people who tried, often the same people. And that understanding that complexity is the only way to honor both the suffering endured and the small lights that still manage to shine.